In the summer of 1945 in Tokyo, Japan's military leadership gathered in reinforced concrete chambers that had been designed to protect them from bombs. But no amount of concrete could shield them from what was coming, a revelation that would shatter every assumption upon which they had built their war. For 3.5 years, these men had convinced themselves of certain truths. That American resolve would crack under sustained casualties, that Japanese spirit could overcome material disadvantages, and that war, though difficult, remained winnable through sheer determination and sacrifice. They had studied American tactics, analyzed captured equipment, and calculated losses with detailed care. What they had never done was truly understand the nation they were fighting. When news arrived from Hiroshima on August 6th, it came as more than a military defeat. It arrived as the destruction of an entire worldview. 3 aircraft, 1 bomb, 1 city erased. And at that moment, everything Japan's generals thought they knew about modern warfare became obsolete. Beneath the Imperial Palace in Tokyo and past ceremonial halls lay a warren of concrete rooms where Japan's senior command gathered daily to wage war. This was not a mere bunker. It was an architectural reinforced wall designed to withstand bombs and, more critically, to insulate those within from inconvenient truths. Inside these chambers, maps covered every surface. Red flags marked Japanese positions across the Pacific, still holding the Philippines, still occupying vast territories in China. Blue flags showed American forces, always depicted as scattered and vulnerable. Admiral Osami Nagano, chief of the Navy General Staff, would trace his finger across these maps with practiced confidence. He explained how each American advance stretched their supply lines thinner, how each victory cost them ships and men they could not afford to lose. The mathematics seemed simple. America was soft, comfortable, a nation of individuals who valued personal wealth over collective sacrifice. Lieutenant General Yoshijiro Umezu, chief of the Army General Staff, reinforced this narrative with his own calculations. American casualties at Tarawa was 3,400. Iwo Jima was 26,000. Okinawa was 50,000. Project those figures across an invasion of the home islands, and the arithmetic became devastating. Millions of Americans died. No democracy could sustain such losses. This was an assumption that governed every strategic decision made in those underground rooms. The Japanese spirit represented an intangible force multiplier that Western materialism could never match. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki spoke of it openly in cabinet meetings. 100 million souls prepare to perish as a shattered jewel rather than submit to occupation. How could a nation of consumers, of individuals seeking comfort and wealth, possibly stand against such collective resolve? Intelligence reports that contradicted this worldview met predictable fates. When analysts presented data on American industrial output, they were dismissed as victims of enemy propaganda. How could reports describing entire cities in America be dedicated solely to manufacturing aircraft? Senior officers laughed. Hyperbole designed to frighten, nothing more. What none of these men acknowledged was what they were actually facing. They were fighting a 1920s war in 1945. Their calculations assumed symmetry. That American production faced the same constraints as Japanese production, and that technological advantages were marginal improvements rather than revolutionary leaps. Inside those concrete chambers, Japan's leadership had constructed a reality where discipline and courage could defeat machinery and science, where Bushido could trump the assembly line and honor could outlast industry. August would teach them otherwise. August the 6th, 1945, began like any other day in the underground complex. Status reports from the front, casualty figures from the latest kamikaze operations. Then, shortly after noon, a communications officer entered carrying a radio transcript, his hands visibly shaking. Hiroshima had ceased to exist. Admiral Soemu Toyota, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, read the message 3 times before looking up. A city did not simply cease to exist. The transcript had to be garbled, the report incomplete. Hiroshima was a military depot, an industrial center, and a city of 300,000 people. To destroy it completely would require hundreds of bombers dropping thousands of tons of incendiaries over multiple days, as had been done to Tokyo in March. Immediate reconnaissance was ordered. Within hours, reports began arriving, each more incomprehensible than the last. Pilots flying over the site described a single, massive column of smoke visible from 400 miles away. Everything within a 2-mile radius had been leveled. Stone buildings had evaporated. Steel structures had melted. Survivors spoke of a light brighter than 1,000 suns, followed by a wave of heat that ignited everything it touched. Hard data was demanded. How many bombers and what payload? The answer, when it finally came from surviving observers and radar stations, broke the laws of warfare as they understood them. 3 aircraft, 1 weapon. Air operations analysts who had led major strikes were summoned to provide technical assessment. They arrived carrying radar logs and observer reports explaining that radar had tracked only 3 B-29s approaching Hiroshima. Standard reconnaissance pattern, no bomber stream, nothing to suggest a major attack. Yet, a city was gone. At that moment, Japan's military leadership was faced with something more devastating: destruction of their basic assumptions regarding how wars were won. Reconnaissance photographs spread across tables told an impossible story. Where Hiroshima had been, there was now a geometric pattern of annihilation. Someone mentioned uranium. Someone else spoke of theoretical physics papers published before the war. Senior command dismissed it all as speculation. What mattered was practical reality. If America possessed weapons capable of erasing cities with single bombs, then every defensive calculation made over the past 3 years was obsolete. Worse, if they had one such weapon, they undoubtedly had more. Months of planning for defense of Kyushu and positioning of thousands of aircraft for anticipated invasion suddenly seemed irrelevant in the face of damage assessments. Carefully constructed defensive strategy, designed to bleed the Americans white on the beaches, now appeared as relevant as a samurai sword against a battleship. Commands tasked with defending Tokyo requested clarification on defensive protocols. If a single weapon could destroy Hiroshima, what prevented similar attacks on Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya? What countermeasures existed, and how should populations be dispersed? There were no answers. You could not disperse a population faster than atomic weapons could be deployed. Over the next 48 hours, as shock gave way to analysis, Japan's high command was forced to confront records they had spent years ignoring. Intelligence files were reopened. Production data was reviewed. And slowly, with mounting horror, the true scope of their miscalculation became clear. Senior staff officers compiled summaries that read like indictments. In 1944, America produced 96,000 aircraft. Japan produced 28,000. America launched 50 aircraft carriers of all types. Japan launched 4. American steel production was 89 million tons, while Japanese steel production was 6 million tons. Aluminum was 920,000 tons versus 140,000 tons. Oil was 200 million barrels versus 2 million barrels. They were not marginal differences. They were not gaps that could be closed through superior tactics or fighting spirit. Reports on American logistics detailed operations Japan could not replicate. Liberty ships were being produced at a rate of 3 per day. America had constructed entire fleets of tankers, transports, and supply ships while simultaneously building warships to protect them. Japan's merchant fleet, by contrast, was hemorrhaging under submarine attacks it lacked resources to counter. Pre-war estimates had projected Japan would need to maintain at least 3 million tons of merchant shipping to sustain military operations. By August 1945, Japanese merchant tonnage had fallen below 1.5 million tons, with losses accelerating monthly. Meanwhile, American production had added over 50 million tons of new shipping since 1942. 50 million tons. Japan's entire pre-war merchant fleet was 6 million tons. These numbers defied comprehension because they revealed a contest that had never been competitive. Japan was not losing a close fight. Japan had been losing from the first day, every day, by margins that grew wider with each passing month. The architect of the kamikaze strategy sat in silence as these figures were presented. His entire tactical framework had been built on the assumption that American production was finite and that losses would compound. The data showed otherwise. For every Japanese aircraft that successfully struck an American ship, America built 50 more planes. For every American carrier damaged, 2 more were launching from shipyards. The kamikaze strategy had not been a force multiplier. It had been a faster way to lose the war. Yet industrial divide, as staggering as it was, represented only half the equation. The other half was more disturbing because it had been invisible. Yoshio Nishina, one of Japan's leading physicists, was summoned to brief the cabinet on atomic theory. He arrived carrying folders of pre-war scientific papers, many authored by Americans and Europeans. In terms generals struggled to grasp, he explained that creating an atomic weapon required more than understanding physics. It required an industrial and scientific infrastructure of almost unimaginable scale. Uranium enrichment demanded specialized facilities consuming more electricity than entire Japanese cities. Plutonium production required nuclear reactors that did not exist in Japan. Precision manufacturing of components that needed tolerances measured in millionths of an inch, machined by workers who understood advanced metallurgy and high-energy physics. Conservative estimates suggested America had invested $2 billion and employed 100 to 30,000 people in the Manhattan Project. For context, Japan's entire military research budget for 1944 was $50 million. Total pool of physicists, chemists, and engineers capable of advanced weapons research numbered perhaps 2,000. Of those, most were recruited into traditional weapons development or deployed to field units. Japan had considered atomic weapons research briefly in 1942 and abandoned it as impractical given resource constraints. This was the invisible war they never knew they were fighting. While Japanese scientists labored in university basements with limited funding and scarce materials, America had constructed secret cities in Tennessee and Washington devoted solely to producing bomb-grade material. Entire facilities larger than many Japanese factories, operating around the clock and staffed by thousands of specialists. Captain Eijiro Suzuki, naval aviation engineer, asked a practical question. Given unlimited resources and time, could Japan replicate such a weapon? Nishina's answer was devastating. To build an atomic weapon, we would first need to build the industrial infrastructure America already possesses. Projections for Operation Ketsugo, the planned defense of the home islands, showed mobilization of 2.3 million soldiers, 10,000 aircraft, and thousands of suicide boats. Against an enemy that could erase cities at will, these forces meant nothing. Courage and discipline offered no defense against weapons that operated outside traditional military logic. The realization was not that Japan had lost battles. It was that Japan had never possessed capacity to win. The war had been decided not at Midway or Guadalcanal, but in American classrooms that produced tens of thousands of engineers annually in a scientific establishment that operated at scales Japan could not imagine. August 9th began with desperate diplomatic activity. Urgent messages were drafted to the Soviet Union seeking mediation. Japan would accept territorial losses, reparations, anything short of unconditional surrender. Moscow had not yet responded to previous overtures, but surely given time. The response arrived at noon. It was not diplomatic. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched a massive invasion of Manchuria. In one stroke, Japan's last hope for negotiated peace evaporated. Stalin had chosen sides, and his choice was final. Hours later, a second report arrived from Nagasaki. Another city, another weapon, another 70,000 dead. In the Imperial General Headquarters, remaining illusions died. The Supreme Council for the Direction of the War convened in an emergency session, 2 atomic weapons in 3 days. If America could deploy them at will, resistance meant systematic extermination. Desperate voices suggested the weapons must be rare, difficult to produce. Perhaps America only had a few. Perhaps they were bluffing about further attacks. Intelligence from neutral sources suggested America was accelerating production of atomic weapons. Switzerland reported American officials privately stating they could deploy 3 to 4 weapons monthly by spring 1946. Whether true or psychological warfare, the implication was identical. Time favored the enemy absolutely. A practical question cut through speculation. Even if America only had 5 atomic weapons, they could destroy Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, and Yokohama within a week. These are the industrial heart of what remained of Japan. And then what? What did victory look like when the enemy could erase your cities faster than you could evacuate them? General Umezu, who had argued most forcefully for continuing resistance, reviewed casualty projections one final time. Operation Ketsugo assumed the American invasion of Kyushu in November, with subsequent assault on Honshu in spring 1946. Japanese forces would contest every beach, every city, every hill. Casualties would be catastrophic on both sides, forcing negotiated settlement. That strategy was now irrelevant. America did not need to invade. They could simply stand offshore and methodically destroy every urban center from a distance. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were demonstrations of capacity, not limits of capability. Prime Minister Suzuki, who had survived decades of military service and political intrigue, recognized the checkmate. Japan's entire defensive strategy rested on making invasion so costly that America would accept conditional surrender. Invasion was no longer necessary. America had found a way to end the war without landing a single soldier on Japanese soil. Kamikaze aircraft meant nothing against weapons delivered from 30,000 feet. Coastal fortifications and millions of mobilized civilians meant nothing when entire cities could be annihilated faster than populations could be dispersed. August 10th, Emperor Hirohito addressed the Supreme Council. His words contained no military rhetoric. He spoke instead of preservation. To continue fighting against an enemy possessing such weapons was to guarantee complete destruction of the Japanese people and obliteration of Japanese civilization itself. Honor demanded many things. Suicide was not among them. War Minister Anami, who had promised to defend Japan to the last man, raised no objections. In their silence was an admission more powerful than any speech. They had been wrong about American resolve and American capability. Colonel Masahiko Takeshita made one final argument: accept death with honor rather than submit to occupation. Let history record that Japan never surrendered. Response came quietly: history will record nothing if there is no Japan to remember it. We cannot preserve honor by ensuring extinction. We fought. We lost. We must now ensure something survives. On August 15th, the Emperor's voice crackled over radio sets across Japan, announcing surrender. In the Imperial General Headquarters, maps came down from walls. Red flags marking Japanese positions were removed. Blue flags representing American forces were left in place, stark and overwhelming in their distribution across the Pacific. Officers reviewing the timeline noted that from the first bomb to surrender had taken 9 days, 3 years of brutal island fighting, millions of casualties, destruction of Japan's Navy and Air Force. And one new weapon, deployed twice, ended the war in a week. 2 months after surrender, as occupation forces landed and war crimes tribunals began their work, senior Japanese officers were granted access to American military records. It was a deliberate act by MacArthur's staff to ensure they understood exactly what they had faced. Requests for production statistics received bound volumes in response. Ford alone had produced more military vehicles than Japan's entire automotive industry. A single American shipyard had launched more tonnage than Japan's combined output. American aircraft production peaked at 1 plane every 5 minutes for 365 days a year. Yet the numbers were simpler. In 1944, America produced 650,000 tons of synthetic rubber. Japan produced 20,000 tons. Synthetic rubber had been produced by America at 30 times Japan's rate, while America simultaneously fought Germany and maintained civilian prosperity. Senior officers reviewing these figures before committing suicide wrote letters to remaining staff in their final days. In them, acknowledgments of what pride had prevented them from seeing. We studied their tactics, we analyzed their equipment, we calculated their losses. We never understood their capacity. Every assumption was wrong. Questions about Manhattan Project timeline revealed that serious work began in 1942. By August 1945, America had produced 3 operational atomic weapons and had materials for several more in production. The war continued into 1946. Projections showed capacity for 3 to 4 weapons per month by spring. By summer 1946, America could have destroyed every major Japanese city. By winter, they could have begun destroying smaller cities, infrastructure targets, and military installations. There would have been no Japan left to defend. After-action reports from Manchuria told another story. Soviet forces had overrun Japanese positions in Manchukuo in 11 days. The vaunted Kwantung Army, once Japan's most elite force, had been routed by an opponent that advanced faster than defenders could retreat. The Soviets deployed 1.5 million troops, supported by 5,500 tanks and 3,900 aircraft, against Japanese forces that lacked fuel, ammunition, and air cover. The result was not a battle. It was a processing operation. These men who had built careers on military excellence, studied strategy and tactics for decades, and who led forces in battle across Asia, confronted the simple truth that they had not understood the war they were fighting. Japan waged war as an extension of national will, measuring strength in discipline and sacrifice. America waged war as an engineering problem, measuring strength in production capacity and scientific output. One side believed spirit could overcome material disadvantage. The other side eliminated the disadvantage entirely by building more of everything than any opponent could match. At the first post-war conference of senior officers, Prime Minister Higashikuni Naruhiko posed a question to assembled commanders. He asked if they could have won. Admiral Toyota responded that they could not have won in 1941 and 1942, and they certainly could not have won after Midway. The question itself assumes a possibility that never existed. Someone asked about the atomic bomb. If Japan had developed it first, would that have changed anything? Physicist Nishina still consulting with the military transition government, answered with clinical precision. He said, "To ask if we could have built the atomic bomb is to ask if we could have become a different nation. America built that weapon because they had the resources, the scientific infrastructure, the industrial capacity, and the national wealth. We lacked all four prerequisites." Context was added. American universities graduated approximately 50,000 engineers annually throughout the war. Japan graduated 5,000. America had 7 times Japan's population, yet produced 10 times as many engineers per capita. The Manhattan Project alone employed more advanced degree scientists than Japan's entire academic physics community. The meeting ended without formal conclusions. What conclusion could there be? You cannot will yourself to superior production, fight your way out of technological inferiority, or compensate for industrial capacity gaps, measured in orders of magnitude. Japan had gambled that a quick, decisive victory would force negotiated peace before America's advantages mattered. When that gamble failed at Midway, they had gambled that American resolve would crack under sustained casualties. When that failed at Okinawa, they had gambled that defense of home islands would be too costly for America to accept. They never understood that America was fighting a different war entirely. A war where cities could be built in secret to produce materials that did not exist in nature, where weapons could be designed by theoretical physicists and built by armies of technicians. Their entire fleets could be constructed faster than opponents could sink them. Intelligence leadership compiled a final assessment marked "for historical record only." Its conclusion was stark, and it says, atomic weapons were inevitable because of American victory. The industrial, scientific, and educational infrastructure that produced atomic bombs also produced everything. It did not determine the outcome. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto died in 1943, shot down over Bougainville. Had he survived to see August 1945, the vindication would have been bitter. He had been right about everything. His only error had been believing his warnings would matter. What doomed Japan was not inferior tactics or lack of courage. It was arithmetic dressed in assumptions. They measured American strength by Japanese standards, assuming resource constraints that did not exist. They convinced themselves that what could substitute for capacity, discipline could replace resources, and that centuries of warrior tradition would overcome industrial modernity. These beliefs were not only wrong, they were lethally disconnected from the reality of 20th century warfare, which raises a final uncomfortable thought for anyone studying their mistakes. What are we in our own moment too proud to see clearly, and what capabilities are we dismissing because they do not fit our understanding of how conflict should work?